All right, folks, can you hear us? Excellent. All right, sorry we're a few minutes late starting. We had some technical difficulties over here. So welcome to the third community Q&A for Service Fabric. Thanks everybody for joining. In the room, so this is Sean McKenna speaking, responsible for dev experience on Service Fabric. And in the room, I've got Vas Turacek, who's responsible for our programming models, and Todd Abel, who drives the monitoring and diagnostics work, among other things. Looks like other team members we've got on the phone, Matt Snyder, who's responsible for data storage, as well as the cluster resource manager and reliability and a whole bunch of other things. And then Mikkel, who's from the Visual Studio team, working on Service Fabric tooling. Do we have anybody else?
I think that's it.
That's okay. So we're actually a little bit shorthanded today because of some vacations, as well as it's actually the Tech Ready conference in Seattle right now, which is the internal field event for Microsoft. So we've got, I don't know, must be thousands of Microsoft field members in Seattle, learning about all kinds of awesome Microsoft technology during the day and taking over all of Seattle's eating and drinking establishments at night. It's quite a strange sight, actually, to see Microsoft people just flooding all of the bars downtown. So with that as introduction, I think we'll do the same kind of style that we've done previously. We are recording the session, and so if you want to just start typing questions into the IM window, we'll pick them up.
Here. Good questions.
All right, first question of the day. I don't know what circumstances can a transaction commit all take a really long time. Situation which takes 24 hours to finish. Matt, if you're on the phone, this one's probably for you. No exceptions thrown, code as usual. And when commit async was hit again, next iteration.
Yeah, so that should almost never happen. 24 hours is way longer than what the default commit timeout would be, which would be 4 seconds. So unless you've modified that, that should never be taking longer than that. Is there a particular 24 hours so it actually did finish, or? Do we know? Time is. Well, so there is specifically no timeout for commit async, but it should normally be fine. 24 hours is still really odd to have seen there, and you should only have seen that if it was taking us that long to actually replicate the data. So I think we probably need to look more at the specific case.
I'm guessing you're not putting in terabytes of data either.
Just been trouble after 24 hours. Yeah, it's really big. The guy said the did finish trouble. Just moving it.
Okay. Seems like something we might want to look into. I remember there was, yeah. And do you see it consistently, or is this just once in a while that this happens?
There's your questions. Yeah, actually, I can answer them here.
Okay.
I don't need anyone because. Yeah.
So I recall there was another report of a similar issue where commit async was taking a while. So it may be something on our end, but we'll definitely look into that one. We'll be sure to track that for you. And if you do, if you do have additional information logs or something like that when it happens, if you send that to us, that would also help out. But we'll definitely track that one internally. Thanks for reporting that.
Yeah, as soon as you see it, get a hold of us on Yammer or
definitely
Stack Overflow or something, and we can look at it. Yeah, but basically that seems really out of the ordinary. Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
So next question from Gary on the getting started template, so the application templates. Mikkel, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. We're going to do some experimentation with the templates in the next few weeks to get the first iteration of inputs on the actual code that's put into it. So probably expect it not in the next, but the release after that of the SDK, which is, if we do our regular release cadence, will be 8 weeks after the next release.
So end of September-ish.
Yeah, that will be.
Yeah, so just as some context, we shipped a bug fix refresh of the 2.1 SDK, what was that, week ago now? And then we're in the final stages of preparing the next feature release, which will be 2.2 SDK, 5.2 runtime. So we expect that to be out probably next week, towards the end of next week, if all goes well. So watch out for that on the blog. And then, as we've been saying on the blog, we're kind of going with a 8-week feature release cadence, which with a interim bug fix release, roughly at the sort of 4-week halfway mark within that window. So we expect to continue that. So yeah, the application templates you should look out for as part of that. It'll be 2.3 SDK. So end of September, maybe early October.
And just a quick follow-up. I'll just put my email address into the chat window. So if any one of you want to sign up for some feedback that we're doing within the next few weeks for that template, I would love to have contact information, and maybe I'll get back to you.
Cool. Thanks, Mikkel. So next question is about reliable actors. Plans to make reliable actors a state machine as per actor model definition. So we actually chose to use a slightly different actor model definition than the traditional one. So ours follows the virtual actor model definition, which was something that was invented by Microsoft Research. So we don't have any plans to migrate the definition of the model from virtual actors to the more traditional definition that you see in things like Erlang and Akka.NET. So we will actually stick to that model there. So I mean, it's weird to say that they're not state machines because they are little state machines regardless, but it's probably not exactly the same as the definition that you see in the traditional model.
Okay, Carlo, when can we expect to see Service Fabric as a PaaS offering like app services? So I assume what you mean here is like a multi-tenant service where you can just deploy your application to a to a cluster that's not necessarily owned by you. Yeah. No immediate plans to do that. That is, it's something that you can think of as being potentially a long-term strategy, but at this stage, we're sticking with the you own your cluster, and we're going to try to continue to fill in the gaps that result in you seeing a little bit more of the IaaS pieces under the hood, but in the short to medium term, we're sticking with the existing model. We're trying not to open too many more fronts. We've got a lot of different things going on, and so while that's a really interesting model, and we think it would be quite compelling to a certain set of customers, it's a big chunk of work, and we want to stay focused on the things that we've already started. But it's definitely something we hear.
Okay, so Vladimir asks, he has a stateless service that rarely collects data and merges it into one huge sorted list from a stateful service that is separated into 10 partitions. And then he uses enumerable async to read items from a reliable dictionary. So it's 10 operations of read in parallel, I assume, for each partition. And then after read transactions close, he sorts the data before returning. Is it an effective way for reading really large sets of data? Or should you use another approach? So what you're doing here is you're basically aggregating things from 10 separate partitions and then trying to merge and sort them all in one place. I mean, it's the only way that you're really going to be able to do that across 10 partitions. There really isn't a different way to do it unless you store all your data in a separate place like a database. So it's reading across. I mean, reading across partitions is generally pretty expensive, but if you only have 10, it should be okay. It kind of depends on how much data you actually have in there. So if you have millions of rows from a database, it's possible the database might be a little bit faster at sorting them than C# code would be. But it's hard to say if there's a better approach to that. Matt, you got any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a lot on why you're keeping them sorted, and do you need, like, are you sorting just the keys? Are you sorting the values based on some predicate value that you're trying to index on, something like that? Depending upon what you're really trying to do, there's two other ways to keep kind of that view, that sorted view, available. One is you'd have to kind of duplicate the data, whatever it was that you needed sorted, in a different service, and then whenever the service that was storing that data, that stateful service, got a new item, it would say, hey, I've got this new item to the service that's keeping that sorted list, and then that sorted list would be always sorted. And if you needed the sorted list, you'd just go to that service, pull it all back in sorted order, and you'd be done. And that way it would always be hot. You wouldn't be trying to do it periodically. The other way to do it is you would keep sort of that sorted list on the ingress. So as each request came in, if it was a new entry, it would be sorted on demand. Those are kind of, one is kind of a view, and the other one is kind of a data flow. So depending a little bit on how much data there is and what exactly the requirements around consistency are, you could build one of those other ways.
Sorry, the requirements is very easy. There are about 10 million of users. This list consists of 10 million of users with the value just point. They have points, and I'm sorting these users by points. And I need to keep this list sorted every time. And I made a little mistake. I sort in this collection very often. Not rarely, but very often. So I need to keep my collection sorted by values of points of 10 million of users. So maybe that's not a good approach, as I understood.
Well, the interesting thing is that you have this distributed across 10 partitions. Do you need to keep it sorted across the 10 partitions?
And you've got a high scoreboard.
Like a high scoreboard.
Yes, that sounds. Yeah. That's some kind of.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing you can do is you can, and maybe you're doing this already, but if you keep the data sorted within each partition, and then you keep the partitions sequential, so where one partition ends, the next one begins, right? So think of your partition range. You essentially keep your keys sorted that way. So you have it sorted within each partition, and then the partitions themselves are actually in order, and then you can sort of just enumerate them all.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Ruben, I think that's just a comment. Orleans will have Service Fabric integration soon. Cool. Looking forward to seeing that. And actually, I'll use that as a point to inject, in case people don't know, we're doing a regular series on the blog about once a month of a roundup of stuff from the community. If either you've written up something that you think might be interesting, or you've seen something that might be interesting to other people that are building applications on Service Fabric, please share those on Twitter and hashtag them either Service Fabric or Azure Service Fabric, and we'll take a look. So we're trying to make sure that everybody's getting to see a lot of the great value that's being built by folks on this call and others. So please let us know about cool things like that. TJ, that is basically the same question. Having a fully hosted service, and that's not something that's in the plans at the moment. Inbuilt service to service streaming communications or PubSub. I don't think there's anything happening.
Yeah, so we don't have currently we don't have plans to build something like that, although we are thinking about it because this request does come up pretty often. There are a few open source projects out on GitHub that you can start out with that were actually published by some Microsoft engineers just on their private accounts. Good place to start, but currently we're not actually working on anything ourselves.
Yes, TJ, acknowledged. We understand the cost for very small deployments.
No. There's no plans to build in event sourcing or CQRS pattern in Service Fabric that I know of. Is he commenting on?
Okay, so Surya comments on. So this was the previous comment on actors. Yeah, the state machine, a finite state machine, and not just the ability to push a state, right? And so we don't have that built in today. So a separate question about changing partition count in production when starting a small cluster and slowly growing. Yeah, so at the moment, the only way to change partition count is to create a new named service and implement your own upgrade strategy, which could be lots of work if you want zero downtime. Alternatively, you can create 1,000 partitions up front and hope it will be enough and scale cluster itself. Yeah, so that's true. So there isn't a way to change partition count, and you're right. The only way to do this is to create another instance of a named service which has a larger partition count. And then you can do one of two things. You can try migrating data from one to the other, but that's very difficult to do without downtime. So typically what people will do if you don't want to start with a large number of partitions up front, is you do this sort of two-level partitioning scheme where you create service instances as sort of a top-level categorization, and then within each service instance you have a partition service, so it's sort of two-layer. And it's a little more complex to do, but if you do it this way, if you set yourself up this way, then you sort of eliminate this problem of running out of partition capacity, because you can always create new service instances. There's really no limit that we impose on creating service instances, so you can sort of keep going like that. Now you can also do what you say here, create 1,000 partitions up front and hope it will be enough. So one of the strategies people will take is they think about how much they're ever willing to spend on VMs. How many VMs are you ever possibly willing to stand up? So it might be something like, 1,000 VMs. Say 1,000 VMs is the absolute upper limit you'd ever really do, and that might even be unrealistic. So if that's your upper limit, then that would also be your partition count, because you'd never really run out of capacity then. And 1,000 VMs is quite a lot. So if you start with 1,000 partitions, you have a lot of room to grow. And in reality, if you grow beyond some wild number like that, odds are you're going to probably start re-architecting anyways. Now, it doesn't necessarily kill performance on a small cluster. And the reason is because those partitions actually all share the same process host. So you're not actually running a lot of processes unless you have a lot of application instances. But just partitions alone, they share process space. So it doesn't really kill performance. The only difficulties you may run into is if you're doing queries across those partitions. The more partitions you have, the more expensive those queries will be, because you have to do separate network requests to these things. So the easy option is creating a large number of partitions up front. the more difficult option, but gives you a little more control, is to do a 2-level style partitioning with service instances that are partitioned. Okay. So Ruben's just got comments about writing actors behave more like actors. Yep. And that's what you do. Cool. I'd be interested to see that, Sergey. If you have this up open source anywhere, it'd be interesting for us to take a look at just to see what you're doing. If not, that's cool too. But if you do, let us know. So regarding scaling up and down and pricing tiers, the VM cluster that Service Fabric is deployed on, are there any lesson learned gotchas you can share, or will Service Fabric just handle it by taking nodes offline, online? And we have not decided whether we would use Azure Runbook to do automatically based on metric form or manually through PowerShell. Who wants to take that? Autoscale.
I can touch on it. So generally we recommend automation, right? Manual operations are generally bad. For scale up down, generally we recommend the use of Azure Autoscale, but I guess you're probably talking about some taking machines down for some other reason. When the machines fail, we of course handle that. If you are actually, or if Azure Autoscale is actually like decommissioning things and scaling down, there are some considerations. For example, if you do it via Azure Autoscale or standard VMSS commands, then you will need to tell Service Fabric, hey, these nodes are gone, or we tend to keep them around and think that they're going to come back at some point. There are steps to follow, and I think we have them published somewhere, but we can chase down the article or write it if we don't. But basically, if you're scaling down kind of transiently, then there's no other additional work you need to do. If you're intentionally scaling down, like say you were going to take the cluster from 10 nodes to 5 nodes, and you're never going to grow again, then there's some additional work to do in order to kind of permanently remove those previous nodes from the view that Service Fabric keeps. That's basically the only hard part. As far as safety goes, if it's going through the standard Azure APIs for, like, say, VM scale set scale down or Azure Autoscale scale down, then those should be safe provided that you're on the right reliability, durability tiers that you select when you set up the cluster. Basically, at lower levels of availability, reliability, durability tiers, there's not as much integration or not as much time given for the services to be healthy. When Azure goes and takes away machines, it won't wait as long before just proceeding. So depending on those exact levels, if they're the highest ones, everything is safe. If they're the lower ones, then you might have some more manual work that you have to do in order to watch things and make sure that those operations are safe.
Ruben, we agree with you. It's not a change that you're likely to see. We're pretty committed to the Orleans model of virtual actors. And so a change in model at this point is pretty unlikely. Now about T-Store, we're going to open T-Store more openly, so you can build custom systems, ES, CQRS, that kind of thing. Matt, maybe you can speak to that one.
Yeah, I don't. Today there's no direct way to work on the T-Store directly, and I don't know that we would. So that's an implementation detail. You can think of it as there's a logging kind of layer, there's a general transactional data store kind of layer, and then there's the actual collections that somebody would write. Typically, we think about people writing their own collections, which could be backed eventually by the log, or could be backed by other physical data stores. I don't know that we have a plan for people to use the T-Store part specifically within the stack as it exists today. What we'd see more likely is that there'd be transactional primitives that we would support, and that we would say, hey, your collection needs to support these types of things. You need to be able to take these kind of transactional locks on things. They should be able to interop with the existing collections in these ways. But I don't know that tstore as an implementation detail of the internals of the collections that we have today is the layer that we would expose. We'd probably expose kind of the layers on top and the layers below that thing, so that people would write their own kind of storage mechanism. So say you wanted to use something entirely in memory and you wanted to write your own in-memory collection. There wouldn't really be as much use for the component known as tstore today. You wouldn't use it because that's kind of a detailed thing about how today's collections store types. So just something to consider. I wouldn't get too bogged down in the details of the internal collections, but the whole point is, yes, in the longer term, we do absolutely expect people to write their own collections. We do expect those collections to have the option of interacting with the collections provided by the platform. If you wanted to stub out the entire state management stack, but keep the rest of services, we expect that to be something people would do as well.
All right, so there's a question about multi-cluster deployment, and is it possible to have cross-cluster communication? So your applications on one cluster can talk to applications on another cluster through a public endpoint that you expose. But there is nothing in Service Fabric that allows applications to sort of auto-magically work across two separate clusters. A cluster is a self-contained entity. So anything you do across cluster would be at the application level, which is your code that you write. So next question about having issues deleting faulty services from the cluster. The only workaround I found is to remove the node and add it back. The cluster so the application you're trying to delete is not present. So this is something that I've run into as well. Typically what will happen is you'll go to delete a service, we go attempt to delete it, but the code is still, your service code is still running, and so the process isn't shutting down. And so basically what you have to do is you have to target that either service instance or service replica and shut it down manually. And so removing a node is one way to do it, but there's actually an easier way. There is a management tool, management operation available in PowerShell and C# that lets you manually remove replicas, and so you can actually target the replica that's still up. And if you look in Service Fabric Explorer under the nodes, you'll see what's actually deployed on each node, and occasionally you'll see something like a phantom replica, which is just sort of hanging around. And so if you go and try to unregister an application type that still has that replica hanging around, the system won't let you, which is probably what you're seeing. And so you can actually target that and just say, remove this replica, force remove it, and we'll just kill it and shut it down. Another trick you can use, if you have access to the node, you can go onto the node and just kill that host process. What will happen is you'll kill the host process, we'll attempt to bring it back up, realize that it's not supposed to be back up, and then we'll kick it down again. So there's easier ways to do it than just removing a node. Generally, the root cause of this problem is service code that is stuck somewhere, not shutting down. It could be something like an I/O operation that's sort of left hanging. And when we trigger your cancellation token in OrnaySync because you have this outstanding I/O operation that's not responding, it's also not responding to the cancellation token, so it'll just kind of sit there. And then the process won't die. So it's just a matter of killing it manually.
So actually, Sergey's question is interesting in terms of connecting people who've gone to production, because one of the things that we've been talking about is how can we continue to grow and strengthen the ties within the community. So doing these Q&As is one of those ways, but we're interested in suggestions from you guys on other ways to get connected. So obviously we're present on a series of forums, and we've got our GitHub page for reporting issues. We have talked about potentially creating a Slack team and having that as an option for people to do sort of more synchronous discussion, both with the product team and with each other. So that's kind of an open-ended question to you on ways that you would like to interact both with other members of the community as well as with the product team, because we want to help make sure that you can stay in touch with us and that you can stay in touch with each other. So feel free to put your feedback in the IM window or on Twitter or wherever on other ways that you'd like us to do that. All right, move on next.
So VMs, are the VMs in VMscale automatically patched Windows updates, or the updates should be installed manually? Do we patch them automatically yet? I don't think we do yet.
No, Matt, you want to take that?
Yeah, so this is a known thing that was a delta between cloud services and VM scale sets. So in VM scale sets, unlike in cloud services, the VM images are not patched automatically, are not updated. So that is left kind of as an exercise to you guys, the users, and that would unfortunately be the case whether or not you were running in Service Fabric or not. We're working very closely with the VM scale set team because the feedback we've gotten from a lot of our customers is that that's not really going to work long term. So we're working with the VM scale set team to make that a priority so that those images would be, kind of pre-baked and rolled out. Now, that's not going to happen, unfortunately, for some time, so there's a bunch of different workarounds available. I think that one thing that Service Fabric is considering doing is having some sort of service which would trap reboots due to, Patch Tuesday, and then at least it would be safe, if not ideal, where you could just turn on Windows Update within the VMs, and at least it wouldn't, we would do the safe thing. Now, that would still be fairly unpredictable. It wouldn't go UD by UD, and there's a bunch of other side effects, but at least it would give an opportunity today. The only other option available today is for we've seen people create their own custom VM image, which they can then give to VM scale sets and say, hey, roll this out, and deploy the cluster on that, and then you can build those images and update them on your cadence with the latest patches. Again, that's not ideal. You have to go write a whole bunch of tooling, a whole bunch of scripts in order to do those rollouts, and you're in charge of building VM images and rolling them out, which is not really what we expect. So we understand that this is a pain point today, and it's called out in our docs, but that doesn't really tell you what to do. It just says, hey, watch out. So we're working with the VM scale set team to make that hopefully something that isn't quite so onerous in the future. I think it's probably going to be sometime, though. I know that in the next 3 to 6 months is when I think the recommendations will pop out from VM scale set folks about how to go do this safely manually, and then at least all the primitives will be there, and then there will be further work done to do this automatically by Microsoft and then roll them out. It's just not there today.
All right, thanks, Matt. Eric asks, can we shut down a Fabric cluster and then re-enable it later to save money without rebuilding it? Well, the only way to do this is to shut down all the VMs, delete all the VMs, but your cluster is a stateful entity, so as soon as you shut down the VMs, you lose all your state, your data, and everything kind of vanishes. So there's no built-in way to do this. The only way that you can do it is simply delete the resource group that had your cluster, and when you come back in the morning, you stand it up again. And of course, you can automate this. We actually have code up. If you look at I sent a link up just above at this is AKMS tries Service Fabric, which is our party clusters. That source code for the party clusters is up on GitHub, and it actually does something similar to what you're asking because it continuously recycles clusters. It stands up a cluster and then after 5 hours takes it down and then puts up a new one, and it's all automated. So if you wanted to write your own set of scripts or tools that automatically takes a cluster down at night and stands one up in the morning, you can take a look at that source code there and see how we do it. But again, you will lose everything that was in that cluster. It'll be a brand new, fresh cluster. Without all of your applications will be gone, all your state will be gone, that sort of thing. So there's no way to just kind of put it to sleep. You have to actually take it down entirely. Can we expose a simple log more directly? What do you think, Matt?
Again, yeah, that's more likely to happen in the T-Store implementation specifically. It's still not something that's going to happen soon in all likelihood. We're kind of focused mostly at the top of the stack at this point, and then figuring out how we want to enable building new collections kind of at the topmost layer with the support for transactions and interaction with the other collections. We're also working on trying to get things that people have been asking for some time, like in-memory collections. And it's absolutely true that we kind of are in this place where today we're still trying to provide a lot of these things first class in the platform. And another way to do it would simply be to provide better interfaces and make it able to be more easily plugged into. And that's sort of the stuff that we're looking into doing. So it's just not there yet in terms of being fit for internal or external consumption, which is part of why we haven't opened up those interfaces yet. I think we're still, learning what those interfaces should look like, frankly, and that's part of why they aren't public today. But once we are able to, finish those, make them look good, make them make sense for the different types of collections that we see people already wanting to build, then they will be opened up. And just a quick example of that is that, if you go look at the interfaces that you would need to implement today in order to implement a custom collection, whether or not you were using the log or not, it kind of has muddled into it whether or not that collection would be in memory or persisted. It kind of presumes that it's persisted because all the collections today are persisted. So we would need to go do some work and some refactoring internally in order to pull those things apart so that your in-memory collection didn't have to go talk to the log because the log is inherently on disk. Things like that are kind of the work that we need to go do before implementing things at that layer is going to make sense, unfortunately. So that's on us.
All right. Is there any way to programmatically restrict the number of actor instances per node? So that's an interesting question. So there isn't a specific API that you can just use to restrict per node, but what you can do is you can restrict the number of actors per partition, which is something you control. So you get to control which partition actors get created in. And that's just a matter of when you create your actor ID, the ID value will actually determine what partition it goes in. So by default, it just goes into a random one, but if you actually put in your own actor ID value, you can control what partition it goes to. So you could control how many actors you have per partition. The thing you don't know, though, is you don't always necessarily know what node the partitions are going to be on. So what you're really doing is trying to restrict the partitions on the nodes, and that you can't really do. But one thing you can do is you can use the query APIs to grab all the partitions of your actor service, and you can look at what node those partitions are on and then keep track yourself just using those query APIs. So you can see how many partitions are on each node, and then since you're controlling which partition the actors go into, you can sort of calculate how many actors are on each node that way. And then it's really kind of up to you to do the actual restriction part. So once you've put those values together, you can decide whether or not you want to create more actor instances on a particular partition based on how many actors are in that partition plus every other partition on that node. So it's really a combination of using the query APIs to figure out where partitions are placed, and then your own logic to figure out how many actors you want to put into each partition, calculate all that up, and then there you go, you got your answer. Of course, you have to do this continuously because partitions can move around, so it will never be a static thing. But there is kind of an indirect way to do it. Okay, so try killing the host process. Yeah, so try killing the replica. There's a PowerShell command for that, and that generally works. You can even write up a little script that will grab every replica in the service and just kill them all, and then just run that every time you have a problem with this. But again, try to get to the root cause of this. Try to figure out why you have replicas that are still hanging around. It usually comes down to service code that isn't exiting, and so see if you can narrow that down. That's usually the best way to do it. That way you don't have to do any manual intervention. All right, it's like we got a lot of +1s for Slack. That's good. And oh, thanks, Ben. So there's a Service Fabric channel on the ASP.NET Core Slack. That's true. Antonio says he uses the party clusters a lot. Yeah, that's good. I'm glad. I'm on there pretty frequently too.
So Ruben on.
You're on Ruben's question.
Okay, the packaging model. Yeah, so we're definitely looking at enabling some sort of packaging format for services. We're doing actually a lot of work around how do we make it easier to build larger applications, and particularly applications that involve a lot more developers. So as you probably know, currently your entire application by default is part of one Visual Studio solution, and so you end up with all those services with full source code inside of that solution, which at some point doesn't really scale very well for development. And so we're specifically at the moment looking at how we do packaging for services to help enable breaking up that application, so you can just work on individual services and then have them be combined into the application, like as part of your continuous integration flow. We don't have any immediate plans to turn that into a Docker Hub type marketplace for those services. It's really more about enabling development teams to work more easily together. That's another thing that's kind of in a very long-term vision, but nothing happening immediately on it.
All right, so it's a question about reminders. We use reminders heavily in our actor-based business workflow. How stable is the current design and implementation? So it's very stable. There's one issue that we're currently aware of and fixing, which causes reminders, the time period when reminders fire, it causes them to reset after a failover. So if you have a 24-hour reminder and 23 hours into it fails over, the clock starts again, and so you won't see a fire for another 24 hours. So that's one thing that we're fixing in the design. But other than that, it is very stable. Both the design and implementation are stable. We don't expect it to change much. Eric asks how to update a cert used by a secure cluster without downtime. So I know there's a way to do this, and it has to do with the primary and secondary certs that you set up when you create a cluster through the Azure portal. I don't know the exact details off the top of my head, but I do know that there's a way to do it. So the guy that our guy that wrote the documentation on that, Chaco, is not here today. Unfortunately, he'd be able to answer that pretty quickly for you. So we might have to get back to you on that one offline, but I know there's a way to do it for sure. Okay, so partitions, yeah, so partitions share process space. It's not a process per partition, so you get a process. So the way processes work is kind of interesting. So you get a process for a service type. So when you write a service and you write your program.cs and you have a main, which is essentially a console application, what you see in there is you see a registration for a service type. And you can register multiple service types in there. And the way it works is that every service type that you register inside that process, when you create an instance of that service type, it'll use that host process. Okay, so service instances will all share a process. And then within a service instance itself, you have replicas of the service. And so each replica of a service also gets created in that same process. Now, a partition itself is actually a distributed thing. So an entire partition isn't inside a process, because a partition is actually distributed across machines. So you'll have a replica set within a partition that belongs to a service, and each one of those replicas of the partition gets created in a separate process or a separate node. Now, if you have a large number of partitions in the service, all of the replicas for that service will be created in the same service host, so they'll share that same exe. Now let's see. So the rest of your question here, you got an unannounced game and be able to share details with points after launch. Great. Well, we look forward to that. That'll be good. So you understand why we don't allow changing partition count during upgrade. And when you don't use reliable collections but still want partitions and routing, for example, in-memory actors, right? Yeah, so repartitioning. So something we've talked about quite often, and it's something that we're sort of researching. It's a very, very difficult problem to solve. Even if you're not persisting to disk, it's still an extremely difficult problem to solve, and it's something that we're actively researching, but we don't have a planned timeline or anything like that on the roadmap for when that'll become available. But it's definitely an interesting problem to solve that we're interested in. Okay, Peter asks, what are your recommendations for handling configuration settings for different clusters? So if you have multiple clusters and you want different configurations for when you go and deploy each one, is that what you're asking? It's either at the ARM level, so you're either defining the cluster itself using Azure Resource Model, and that's just having different ARM templates for each cluster, and that'll define the settings for the clusters, right? If you're talking about, and it looks like you're talking about customers that use a lot of pre-production environments, so I'm guessing you're talking about you have a dev, test, pre-production, and production environments, so different clusters for each one of those. So managing the clusters themselves, again, is just ARM templates, but deploying the applications to those different environments, and you probably want to tweak settings in the applications as you go and deploy them to those different environments. And there is a way to set app settings, which we call application parameters. So when you go and create an application instance, you can specify application parameters that you want to pass to the instance. And those application parameters, you can kind of flow those down through your various config files. So you can use those application parameters if you're defining your services as default services in your application manifest, which is what Visual Studio does by default. You can take those application parameters and flow those down to the default service settings. So you can set things like replica count, partition count, instance count, that kind of thing. Those can be overridden using application parameters. And then if you want to use application parameters inside your services, inside your own service code, you can actually flow those application parameters through into your config package where you have a settings.xml. And so if you look inside your settings.xml, if you're using that, which I think you mentioned here in the samples, the configurations are in the XML files, yeah, settings.xml, right? So what you can do, when you define a parameter in settings.xml, there's a property or an attribute you can use that says must override. And what that means is that somewhere from the application level, that parameter must be overridden, and that happens when you go and create the application instance. And so you use the syntax, and I think we have an example of this up on GitHub somewhere. Use this square bracket syntax, which basically just flows variables through. And so you define these application parameters in your application manifest, and then when you go and define your service manifest imports, you can put in the config overrides there, and then when you go and create an application instance, you can just say, I want to use these parameters for this application instance. So what this means is that when you go and create an application instance in your test environment, you can provide some application parameters that are specific to your test environment, and then you can do the same thing for pre-prod and the prod and things like that too. And that's all available if you're creating your applications through our management APIs, either through PowerShell or C# or HTTP. You can go and specify those application parameters. You have an additional option too, which is only available in the C# APIs, the C# management APIs. When you go and create an application instance, you can actually provide an array of bytes, which is just anything you want, any blob of data you want. And that's, again, another set of, you can think of it as like arguments to a console application, except that it's binary data instead of string arguments. And so when you go and create an application instance through C#, you can just pass it a binary blob, and that could be whatever environment-specific information you want it to be. So there's a couple ways to do that.
And just one more thing on app parameters. The default Visual Studio behavior is that those parameters are defined in application parameter files, which are in the project. And so those are passed through as part of the deployment if you deploy from Visual Studio. But you can also, if you want to have them just as environment variables or get them from somewhere else, you can pass them in directly on the command line when you're creating the application instance. So you don't need to have, if you have sensitive information, you don't necessarily need to have them in the app parameters files in your source. You can just pick them up dynamically as part of the app creation.
Yeah. All right, Lars asks, are there any plans to reduce the overhead of developing as opposed to deploying an actor? So right now you have 2 Visual Studio projects each has a bunch of files and references to manage. Actor event source that you have to update, which can get tedious. And you have to write a bunch of boilerplate for PubSub, which is how your actors communicate, as well as some boilerplate for state management. So it sounds like, so I mean, what we kind of give you with the actor framework, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of boilerplate you don't have to write. For example, for service communication and things like that. So a lot of that stuff's actually built in. What we don't give you on top of the actor framework is more frameworks like PubSub and things like that. So in terms of PubSub, yeah, that's something we talked about earlier. We are thinking about it, but we don't have concrete plans. Yeah, we don't have concrete plans for that yet, but we're definitely thinking about it because it is a common thing to ask. Now the files and references to manage, I'm not sure if there's a lot that we can do about that. The actor event source itself is there for you. We give that to you in source code because it's really there for you to modify, using this this semantic logging pattern where you write logging methods, separate logging methods for everything that you want to log. So it's really there for you to use and modify. It would be kind of weird to have that compiled in because then you wouldn't really be able to change it.
So the two VS projects that you're referencing, you talking about the actor service and then the interface project, or something else?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the interface project is separated out because that interface needs to be shared between the service and the client code that's calling it. So that's kind of part and parcel of the actor proxy model.
Yeah, and that I don't think we would change. I mean, you can obviously yeah, they're in the same application. It's really up to you. You can go ahead and combine those two if you really want to, so that you don't have that extra project. Typically, we try to keep them separated out, so it's think of it kind of like a domain model, right? So you have one project, one DLL that's shared, which just has interfaces, and so you're not actually referencing the implementation DLL. And so it helps to keep those things separated so that if you go and change, for example, if you have two services that talk to each other over this interface and you want to change the code in one of those services, it doesn't affect the other one. So when you go and do an upgrade, you don't have to upgrade both services. You only have to upgrade the one that changes. And that's because they use this interface DLL as a separation. Your solution explorer looks like a mess. Yeah, you do end up with a lot of projects. Yeah, if you have a lot of services, you'll end up with a lot of projects. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying earlier. We're doing work, and actually we'd probably be interested in talking to some of you folks in the fairly near future about some of the prototypes that we're looking at in terms of being able to isolate down your development of individual services, but still have them roll up into a larger application. So hopefully that'll make your solutions look a little bit tidier if you're really just focused on one or two services at a time. Natural mapping from a customer to a cluster.
Sergey, can you elaborate on what you mean by a natural mapping from a customer to a cluster?
You talking about like your customer? Okay, so whether you should have a cluster per customer or do sort of multi-tenant, right? I think that's sort of largely up to you based on the level of segregation that you want to have. I think most of the customers that we've seen have been building multi-tenant services. So they have a single cluster that they scale up, and then they have multiple of their customer applications running on there, often as different application instances. So generate one application instance for a given customer is one model that people use. Other people have.
Yeah, it really depends. I mean, it really depends on what kind of isolation your customers require. Managing a lot of clusters, one cluster per customer, is going to be a lot more work than just managing applications. And obviously, the reason is because the Service Fabric is designed to help you manage a large number of applications on a single cluster. But it assumes that you are on a single cluster. Once you go and do multiple clusters, you have to manage those clusters yourself. Azure helps you with that through ARM a little bit, but you're still left to your own devices for the most part. So if you can do a multi-tenant setup where you put all of your customers on the same cluster, that would be ideal from a management standpoint, as long as that's acceptable in terms of isolation. One common way of doing this is defining an application type that represents your users and their workloads and their accounts and things like that. And then each new user that comes in gets an instance of that application. And then at that point, they're at least separated by process space. So the application instance is sort of a process boundary. So they'll never be sharing the same process. And then you can do things like, I've seen people do things like where a customer will come in they'll get an application instance and they'll have to provide their own Azure subscription that they have a Key Vault created in, so that the customer is the owner of Key Vault and their own secrets and their own keys and things like that. So there's a couple ways you can do that. Let's see, where do we leave off? Solution Explorer looks like a mess. Yes. One actor interface project for all of your actor interfaces. Yeah, I do this sometimes too. If I'm writing applications with using the remoting stack, is I'll sometimes just pile up all my interfaces into a single project just for management, and that works okay too. Okay, so trying to remove replica. Ah, yes. Okay, so the script worked great. Yeah, so if you can basically write a simple loop that goes and grabs all the replica IDs from a service and then just kill them all at once. Let's see. Okay, so is it a bad idea to model a graph with actors? I think it's going to depend a lot on what you're doing with that graph. The thing to remember if you're going to model a graph with actors is that every time you communicate from one node of the graph to another node, it's an expensive call because it's potentially going to another machine. And even if they happen to be on the same machine, you still pay the expense of serializing all of your data, going through the transport stack and all that kind of stuff, and deserializing it back. So depends on what you're doing with it, but if you want to have a graph that you can traverse very quickly and efficiently, it's probably going to end up not being terribly efficient, just because of the distributed nature of it and the overhead that comes with it. And so it looks like you got an access control system. They'll need to keep track of permissions per node. And a node can be a location, an office, or a plant. Okay, so when you say node, you mean a graph node and not a VM. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, again, you can model it with actors, and it probably seems kind of natural, but I would just be a bit cautious about the performance impacts that it could have. You might be better off modeling the graph on just a stateful service and keeping the entire graph within one partition so that the graph kind of lives together, right? And if the graph is small enough where you can fit the entire graph into a single partition on a single machine, you'll probably get much better perf that way because it's just all local. If your problem is that the graph is very, very large and you have to distribute it out across multiple machines, then you're going to end up something like you're talking about vectors.
All right, we're a few minutes over time. If there are other questions, please get them in. Otherwise, we'll wrap it up for today. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, guys. Lots of great questions once again, and we'll make sure to get the recording posted up on YouTube and tweet that out in case people want to go back and take a look. And then please do keep suggestions coming in terms of how we can continue to build this community. We'll definitely take a look at the Slack team possibility given the interest that was expressed here. And we'll schedule another one of these for probably end of August. So we're going to try to keep a monthly cadence going. So with that, we'll let you get back to the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.